Welcome to FO Talks. With me is noted historian, rakish polo player, and all-around brilliant guy, Trippa Daman, and he is joining us from Geneva. Good to have you here, Trippa. I guess I should mention, my name is Christopher Roper-Schell. I was on Capitol Hill for a long time, ran for Congress, and spent some time at the Pentagon, and so my background in policy and interest is quite keen. Good to have you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure.
So today we're going to talk about India's upcoming election and what it means. Let's dig right in. Paint us a picture of the Indian democratic system. It's parliamentary democracy with a first past the post voting, but how exactly does it work?
So the first thing to really think about when talking about India is that while it resembles Westminster in outward form, it actually functions very differently. So it is a parliamentary democracy, and it does have a first past the post system. But beyond that, there are quite a few things that one needs to keep in mind. The first is that India has something called the 10th schedule of the Constitution, which is the anti-defection law, which technically and legally prevents parties or individual legislators from crossing the floor. So you cannot defect to another party unless and until at least, I think it's 50% of the party follows you. And otherwise, the speaker can, the speaker can disqualify you from membership of the parliament or of the assembly. So that's one, which was ostensibly meant to stabilize parties, but has resulted in party bosses having a pretty untrammeled grip on parliamentary parties and emasculation of individual legislatures largely. The second is that the executive has an extraordinary position of extraordinary dominance. So the executive more or less decides when parliament is summoned and when it's prorogued. The only caveat being that more than 6 months can't elapse between two parliamentary sittings. And so unlike Britain, where parliament tends to sit more or less throughout the year with short prorogation periods, the Indian parliament tends to meet for very short periods, generally 3 times a year, and tends to have large periods of prorogation in the middle. The second aspect that really cements this executive dominance is the power of the ordinance. So the Constitution grants the executive the power to legislate in place of the legislature in peacetime when Parliament is not in session. So it's very easy for a government to prorogue Parliament, which happens quite regularly, and then to pass, or in a sense, create legislation by executive fiat, and then present it more or less as a fait accompli to Parliament when it comes back several months later.
So the executive has quite a bit of power here.
The executive has extraordinary powers. So these two things combined, first and foremost, the Anti-Defection Act, which prevents legislators from even voting against party diktats. So as soon as a whip is issued, an individual legislator is obliged on pain of disqualification to obey it. And the second, which is the power of the ordinance, and the third, of course, which is the ability to summon and dismiss parliament at will, more or less cements executive despotism in India's context. So while it is a parliamentary democracy, it is an executive-heavy democracy of the kind that's very rarely seen in the West.
Okay, we'll get more into the executive powers. For a moment, let's continue focusing on the parliament itself. What is the difference between the upper house, known as the Rajya Sabha, and you'll forgive me for the pronunciation, I've got another one to butcher, and the lower house, the Lok Sabha. What roles and powers do they have? You've already mentioned that they're somewhat diminished, but what powers do they have?
Yes, so like Westminster, we have 2 houses. The Lok Sabha, the lower house, is directly elected in the general election of the kind that's ongoing right now. The upper house, or the Rajya Sabha, is the Council of States. So each state, the legislature of each state will elect a certain number of MPs to the upper house, who are meant to represent the interests of the state, and in a sense are a symptom, or are supposed to be a symptom of India's federal structure, or
Those in the upper
quasi-federal
house are
structure.
directly elected?
No, so those on the upper house are elected by the legislatures of each state. So they're indirectly elected in that the provincial legislature will be directly elected, and that provincial legislature will in turn elect the members of the upper house of parliament. So they're
So this
not.
system is somewhat similar to America's old system. The Senate
Yeah.
was not always directly elected, and so the Indian Parliament is a little bit closer to that.
So unlike Britain, it's not appointed, which is what happens to the House of Lords in Britain. And also, unlike Britain, people aren't appointed for life. So the upper house has a tenure of 6 years, and with 1/3 of the members retiring every 2 years. So there's an election that happens every 2 years, and 1/3 of them, so it's staggered. They all serve 6-year terms.
Okay.
But the elections happen in staggered fashion, so that 1/3 of the members retire every 2 years.
So there are some similarities with the US system, with the British system. How does it compare to the Swiss system?
Well, Switzerland is very, very different. Switzerland, of course, has in Switzerland, it's if you ask someone on the street who their MP is, or even who the president is, it's very different because things go into referendums, which is a uniquely Swiss thing. Last year, or I think maybe it was earlier this year, the Swiss voters voted to give themselves an extra month's pension, so 13 months of pension rather than 12, which is something their representatives and their government didn't want. So in India, it's very different. Legislation will generally, though it can be introduced in the upper house as well, it is generally introduced in the lower house, requires a simple majority also in the upper house. And then, of course, the consent of the president.
Okay.
But the lower house is generally where all of the action is.
Okay. And we're going to move a little bit into constitutions. I know you have this is in your background. In the US, the Constitution is revered. In India, there may be a different sentiment. How do Indians feel about their Constitution?
So to start off with, India's constitution is there is a joke often made, which is that it's a periodical rather than a Bible, and that's because it's been amended well over 100 times. I think it's 107 or 108 times that it has been amended, and it was amended for the first time even before the first general election happened. So the original constitution was enforced on the 26th of January 1950. And on the 1st of June 1951, it saw its first amendment. So, which was quite drastic, and it was also diametrically opposite to the American First Amendment. So what we did was we moved to restrict freedom of speech and expression, because the government of the day decided that well, they'd granted a bit more freedom than they had originally anticipated.
Now, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yes, so that was, of course, one. And then the other thing that's very notable about India's constitution is that it's extremely detailed. It's voluminous. The American Constitution, I think, consists of some 14 sections, whereas India's constitution runs to some, 300 and over there are 350 sections to it, and it's the most voluminous.
Even globally speaking, the American Constitution is short. Globally speaking, the Indian Constitution is, I'm pretty sure, the longest.
There are well over 350 articles, and they go into almost excruciating detail. So, and partly this was, in a sense, meant to compensate for the lack of pre-existing democracy or experience of democracy when the republic was formed, because the idea was that if you codify everything in such great detail, then it will compensate for the fact that people don't really have too much experience of working a democracy or of existing in a democracy.
So the length was intentional.
Yes, yes, very much so. Uh, and and in some cases, there are many things that they go into which were essentially compromises. So you have things which are in a part of the Constitution called the Directive Principles of State Policy, which are meant to quote unquote guide state actions. So they're neither legally enforceable nor justiciable in any form, but they're meant to, in a sense, in the background, guide the actions of the state. And many of these can be deeply problematic because obviously there is an injunction for equality. But then there are others which are quite vague, which is, well, the state should endeavor to
In
protect
fact, it
cows.
abolished the caste system right off the bat, if memory serves.
Well, the Constitution did, because it
Yeah.
starts off, it gave, there were several revolutionary aspects to it. There was, of course, the legal right to equality, the abolishing of caste, the granting of universal franchise, irrespective of caste, creed, gender, anything. And that was, I mean, that was a huge revolution. It was almost that was the case at a point where this certainly wasn't the case in the US. And also the case that there was never any real struggle about the fact that there was going to be de jure legal equality and that there was going to be a universal franchise. So that was
And
never in doubt.
we should mention to the viewers that you're quite the expert here. Your book, 16 Stormy Days, The Story of the First Amendment to the Constitution of India, very well-received book, so you know whereof you speak. Moving into journalism a bit, I read that the Sunday Guardian, in reviewing your book, said this book could not have been distributed under former PM Nehru. Why do you think he said that? Why do you feel that your book could not have been distributed at that time?
Well, that's firstly because the book is extremely critical of Nehru. And one of the things that Nehru was susceptible to was that he really didn't like criticism. And that's part of the reason I mentioned something called our First Amendment, which was diametrically opposite to the American First Amendment. And that arose because of how much criticism and how much blowback the first government, that was Prime Minister Nehru's first government, was receiving. And they found themselves unable to clamp down on speech that they used to consider seditious, because sedition had been more or less given the right to freedom of speech as written in the Constitution. Sedition had become unconstitutional, or the crime of sedition had become unconstitutional. Many of the public safety acts which had been used previously to ban magazines or to censor newspapers had become unconstitutional. So all of the legal tools that the government had to clamp down on free speech, to censor free media, to ban the circulation of certain magazines or certain outlets that they didn't like, had fallen apart. And so this is what the First Amendment was about. So my book really shined a spotlight on that aspect. And another thing that it, in a sense, did by virtue just of bringing out these issues was historicize many of the current crises or current questions that Indian democracy faces, because freedom of speech and the use or misuse of sedition laws has become a defining feature of India's kind of current contemporary
So free speech
climate.
was given and then slightly pulled back right early on.
It was given, and then the results weren't appreciated by the rulers, and so it was largely taken back in constitutionally very, very soon.
And well, we're going to get into. Go ahead.
I just if I could quickly push this in, and the reason that the reviewer says this is that India has a history of banning books, of censoring information, and Nehru himself banned many books in his long reign, and it's quite likely, especially books that were critical of the Congress viewpoint. found themselves not
Right.
necessarily banned, but in a
Nehru's
sense,
party. Yeah.
Nehru's party. But it was easy to find yourself sidelined if you were in academia, or subjected to other kinds of pressure, and
Yeah.
it was very easy for most likely it the outcome that it may not have been published is not that far-fetched.
Okay. We're going to return to free speech in a moment. Indira Gandhi was the last leader to dramatically amend the Indian Constitution. We've talked about these many amendments, but
Mhm.
they sort of trickle out. And she did so in the 1970s. After this election, would you expect major constitutional changes?
Honestly, I don't, mainly because what constitutional changes would he need? So Modi, if you were someone who thinks Modi's authoritarian, he's an autocrat, he's taking India down an anti-democratic path, then the first thing I would say to you is he hasn't, if he can do all of these things without making any legal or constitutional changes whatsoever, then there's no real incentive for him to tinker with the constitution, because
Hmm.
that if it's already giving him what he wants, then there's no real incentive for him to try to change it, because changing it would arouse a storm of criticism, and would, in a sense, try give some credence to the view that he is
Right.
anti-democratic and he's authoritarian,
Right.
which
Is
is
there any scenario that you can see where there would be substantial constitutional revisions? I mean,
the only scenario that I could see it in is if they were to try and bring about a common civil code for the country, because as I as most people most India watchers are aware, but just to lay the groundwork out, India has separate civil law for different religions. So if you're Muslim, you're governed by a separate civil set of civil laws. If you're Hindu, you're governed by a separate set of civil laws, and ditto for the other groups. And there has been a long-standing demand particularly from the Hindu right, that civil laws be harmonized and the country be subjected to what is called a universal civil code. So everyone
mhm.
be subject to the same set of civil laws. And that is an ongoing debate. And every now and then, the Modi will and the BJP will kind of poke at it. But there doesn't seem to have been any particular serious thinking in the public domain about this. So, if should it materialize, it might require constitutional changes. But given that no serious thinking seems to have been done about it in the public domain, I'm I'd be surprised if this is something that is imminent. It's
Yeah.
something that may materialize in a third Modi term, but it certainly doesn't seem that it's something that's going to happen immediately upon re-election. And it's
You
certainly not
mentioned,
a yeah, it's certainly not a re-election plank that he's putting his money on.
okay. You mentioned a moment ago about if your perception of Modi is that he
Hmm.
is authoritarian and he's able to
Hmm.
execute whatever he wants, you don't need major constitutional changes.
Hmm.
There has been a lot of focus in the Western press,
Hmm.
certainly in the American press,
Yeah.
on India's, well, I'll read you from a recent Vox piece titled, "Everyone is Absolutely Terrified Inside a U.S. Ally's Secret War on Its American Critics." That's
Hmm.
that's a humdinger of a title.
Yeah.
And it talks about the Indian government's harassment of journalists, human rights advocates, the assassination plots of Canadians and Americans.
Hmm.
Uh, what do you make of this?
I mean, I'm not really one to give. I guess I don't really know enough to give you a solid opinion on the alleged assassination plots. They could be true, they couldn't be true, and I think it's best to wait for the trials to unfold. I will, however, take on the question about repression. Now, there's no doubt that the Indian government has utilized uh, quite a lot of draconian legislation to clamp down on critics, to tame the media, and so on and so forth. But while he has done that, that isn't something unique to him. So those are tools that have been utilized. All of those tools predate him. So let's start with the fact that all of those legal tools predate him. They have been utilized by previous governments, and it's not something that's unique to him.
Were those governments also the Congress Party?
Yeah.
Modi is with the BJP. We had the Congress
Yes.
Party before.
The Congress parties, but also crucially the regional parties. So this regional parties, which govern in several of India's states, have actually been, and law and order is a state subject, have crucially been incredibly authoritarian in their outlook and in their behavior, and this includes both, in a sense, taming the state machinery and utilizing it for their own electoral benefit, but also malicious use of police reports, first information reports, registration of crimes, of potential crimes, jailing of dissidents and opponents, and all sorts of things.
So when you read about democratic backsliding, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you're saying there isn't really backsliding because this has been done before.
No, yes, very much so. So I wrote a piece last year in the Journal of Democracy, and where I argued precisely this, that backsliding is actually the wrong way of looking at it, because it only appears, first, that this has been done before. Secondly, that seems to be an equal opportunities attitude. So even the governments of other parties in states ruled by many of these regional parties where opponents of these regional parties are subjected to similar harassment and similar repression. And the third is that this backsliding only appears as backsliding from a point in the 90s and early noughties, when India had coalition governments, sometimes consisting of dozens of parties, over 20 parties in one case, where there was no real executive dominance, because the executive itself was so splintered that many of these quote unquote independent institutions, whether they were the Supreme Court, whether they were investigative agencies, whether they were the Controller and Auditor General, and crucially also the media, were able to exercise a kind of power which they didn't before and they haven't after. So India is fundamentally, legally and constitutionally, doesn't really have the kind of freedom or the kind of, in a sense, public sphere amenable, or political culture or constitutional background or legal status amenable to that kind of freedom. That freedom only exists, or existed, as one might say, because of coalition governments which could not exercise the kind of executive dominance that single parties do.
Okay, so you're talking about being constrained during times of coalitions.
Yes, but constrained not by the checks and balances of the system. So it's not the executive being constrained by the legislature, or
by the necessity of coalitions themselves and brokering deals.
Yeah.
And we in America, we see this where if you have the House, the lower body, the Senate, the upper body, and the White House, that seems to be a different rodeo than when you have what's called divided government, where the executive may have to make some deals in order to get anything through.
Yeah.
So you're talking about sort of traditional power politics as opposed to backsliding and and this is another one we read a lot, the declining state of the country's democracy. I encounter this phrase all the time, not only in the Vox piece. I see this, God knows the New York Times likes to talk about the implosion of Indian democracy. So you're just saying this is a function of basic power politics. Is that true?
Basic power politics, constitutional structure, legal architecture, procedure, even regular administrative and government procedure. These are all very, very different from the image. There's an image of India that's crafted, which is not entirely true. And as I like to say, Modi is less a departure from the norm than he is a confirmation of it. So all single party rule in India has tended uh, towards behavior that would, in a sense, be considered quasi-authoritarian in the West, but it is very much par for the course in India. Now, if one were to say, okay, even from the opposition side, in no one's manifesto is there a concrete proposal for the rollback of of any of these laws or any of these constitutional provisions that provide cover for these laws. The argument that seems to be being made is that this government is authoritarian because of a kind of temperamental deficiency in Modi, which is fair. Maybe he is, I don't know him personally, maybe he is an autocrat by temperament, and maybe this is what he likes to do. But if your rights are left at the sort of mercies, at the caprice of the executive, and it's solely up to the discretion of whoever's sitting on top to decide whether or not you'll have your rights or not, or whether you will have those freedoms or not, then it should raise a very fundamental question as to how much freedom did you have in the first place, which is a question that somehow doesn't seem to get raised as much as it should.
Well, pursuant to those freedoms, another story that's made a lot of news here in terms of, the individual's vote and the transparency of democracy is on February 15th of this year, the Supreme Court struck down a bond structure that was used for elections. Now, I can tell you what I read over here, and it is principally about dark money funding the BJP. If you can find it, there appears to be a backstory in that this structure was intended to fight what we would call dark money, and that there were some adverse outcomes. Can you just briefly walk us through? I mean, is this rampant corruption, as you would read in a lot of the Western media? Was there a beneficial intended outcome that wasn't quite struck? What happened there?
I mean, there's an element of truth to both sides of the story. So the argument that it was a tool for cleaning up dark money rests on the fact that it allowed companies or corporate entities to donate to parties anonymously. So in a sense, they would donate through legal means, through bank means. They would buy something akin to bearer bonds and hand them over to the parties that they wanted to. And there would be, given that transaction would remain anonymous, no one would know who is giving that money. And so the idea behind it was, given that the whole scheme was being run by India's central bank, companies would be safe from political harassment. So you could donate money with the knowledge that your name wouldn't become public. And so if you donated to party X, party Y wouldn't start targeting you in case they came into government. Now, that is one side of the story, and it is given the tools that are at the state's disposal. Again, going back to what I was saying about India's legal architecture and the concentrations of power that it produces, that is one argument, as in there is some logic to that argument. It's not completely being picked out of the ether. The other side, of course, is that if you legalize in a sense, the donation of money and kind of these anonymous structures, non-transparent structures of money being funneled into politics by corporate entities, then it's essentially a method of legalizing corruption. And that is also a very fair argument, in that part and parcel of democracy requires a degree of transparency. So the Election Commission requires each individual candidate, for example, when they stand for election, to furnish an affidavit giving all of their financial details of their holdings, what shares they hold and what companies they hold them in, so on and so forth, what property they own. as a way of ensuring transparency so that a voter can exercise their choice with a very large degree of knowledge. And if that is something that's applicable to individual candidates, it should, of course, also be applicable to political parties.
And now that it's been struck down,
Mhm.
do we go back to a system that is more or less transparent?
So what happened in this case was the older system was also entirely opaque because people would donate money, oftentimes not through bonds and not through bank accounts, but through suitcasefuls of cash.
There's a book and a movie called White Tiger about a young
Yes.
man who starts off and one of his first jobs is helping his boss deliver the probably Louis Vuitton bags full of cash to politicians. And
And
I guess, it's interesting the mechanism, it gets struck down. The story over here is that this whole thing was created to rig it for the BJP. I guess my
no, but
question is, was the old
I
system
just
any
want to
better?
mention, yes, but that's just one of the things that I want to mention about it being struck down is that nobody knew what was happening in the old system, and nobody knew what was happening in the new system either. The only way that it's been discovered was that the court forced the banks to disclose details
Yes.
that would otherwise have remained under wraps. And so it's what we've discovered is just a snapshot of what happened between the years 20, whenever this scheme came out, I think it was 2016 maybe, and 2020. So
Yeah.
it's what we've discovered is imagine if, whereas the political scene is constantly dynamic and moving, what you get is like someone taking a still picture of something that's ongoing, of like a track and field event. So that is what we've got. And the new system is also unlikely to be that transparent because the first is that the electoral system itself requires a certain amount of money to be at the disposal of candidates, to be at the disposal of constituency parties, to be,
And
and
it's
so
an
that,
enormous amount of money
yeah,
from what I was reading
mm,
recently. I mean, more
yeah,
money, I think I read, than will be spent in the US elections. I mean,
big,
it's a,
yeah. So the amounts of money, if so, that is precisely the point that I was going to make, is that if you look at the sum figure that these electoral bonds generated, it certainly is only part of what goes into political and electoral financing in India. It never was the whole story. And the rest of the story is, well, I mean, it continues to be what it was because of a, I mean, many people do argue that you should have, there should be legalization of lobbying, there should be legalization of raising campaign finance through donations. There should be, in a sense,
are you saying those things are prohibited in India? Lobbying
yes,
and
yes,
direct funding
yes,
for your campaigns?
yes. So one of the big
I didn't
question,
know that. Yeah, that's interesting.
one of the things that happens is the election commission has a ceiling on how much an individual candidate can spend on the election campaign. So it might be say 2.5 million rupees, or like or 5 million rupees or 10 million rupees in the case of a candidate for a provincial legislature, and it might be five times that number uh, for a parliamentary election. But so
These are large numbers. These aren't, I look at what a congressional campaign costs, and you're talking anywhere from $1 million up to, US dollars, way higher. So these aren't
these aren't very
absolutely
large
ludicrous
figures. No.
sums.
So
Yeah.
if a parliamentary candidate in India was to spend, say, $1 million, uh, he cannot legally spend $1 million on his campaign because the election commission has already put a ceiling of, say, half that number, right? So now if he has to spend that amount of money, he has to spend it uh, under the radar, below the table. To
Mm.
spend it under the radar, below the table, he can't be taking donations, and even worse, he can't be drawing it out of anything that can be tracked back to him. So he has to do it, as they say under the table in the form of suitcasefuls of
So we're back
cash.
to we're back to the suitcases of
We're
cash.
back to that, and it seems to be, or appears to be, quite an open secret in India. So my own opinion is that things would become better if, taking cognizance of reality, they actually liberalized or these laws and these administrative structures to be more representative of what is going on and to enable a kind of cleaner raising of finance and also a cleaner spending of the finance.
Why would they not do that? Does this murky financing, does it behoove any one party, or do both parties just kind of agree, no, we like the dark money. We like,
I
shady
think
financing.
I think all parties agree to it to up to a certain extent because this and as I said, the kind of authoritarian features of India's legal and constitutional architecture constitute a pretty bipartisan consensus as far as Indian politics is concerned. First, because it allows for the raising of corrupt money, which lets you, engage in quid pro quo with business, with contractors, etc. This, and in the same way as these legal and constitutional tools allow you to repress or in a sense try to defang your opponents, which is also a thing that Indian politicians tend to love.
So,
So
that's, good for the goose, good for the gander sort of thing.
and in many senses, it's good for the voters as well, because what happens is first that this corrupt money in many ways is channeled back in elections, which are a huge economic activity. So it's not as if all this money simply lines the pockets of the politicians who then just stuff it in their mattresses or keep it. It's spent in the election. And what it's spent on is it's spent on trying to influence by voters, whether it's campaigns, whether it's on sort of old-fashioned distribution of liquor and other inducements. In South India in particular, it's been gotten to a point where people will often promise refrigerators, washing machines, microwaves,
Sure,
and
the
other
chicken in every
consumer
pot, as they'd say here.
other consumer goodies. So it's a system that it's not ideal, but enough people tend to benefit from it to make change difficult.
Yeah, of course, the problem in terms of a democracy, I mean, they set these campaign caps. It becomes who has the biggest bag of money, right? There may be caps, we don't follow them. We can buy off the voters with refrigerators, as you said. So it is, if it is not viewed by the Indian population as corruption, it certainly can undermine a sort of squaring off and
I mean,
more
what
level
it
race.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is there's a cultural background to it, right? So there was a lot often to do with the influence of the Hindu ascetic tradition, but also of Gandhi and others, the idea of frugality, of thrift, of kind of moral censure of conspicuous consumption and conspicuous spending. And I think that still continues to have a very large influence on India's political culture. So it's considered, in a sense, bad form to flaunt the spending of money on an electoral campaign, which makes it more likely that you will spend it on underhand means than you would on a sort of a more open things like
So there's a kind of
advertisements.
social constraint there.
Yes,
Okay.
that's very much what I tend to the explanation that I tend to lean towards.
Okay, we've dwelt on that. In the upcoming election, what are the issues? What is at stake? Where do the parties stand on these issues?
So if you'd asked me this question about a month ago, I would have said that there doesn't seem to be much of an issue apart from the election being seen as a referendum on Modi himself. But given how the campaign has progressed, there are several things that have really kind of been brought up. The first, of course, is the language of rights and the questions of redistribution, which have been perennial favorites in Indian election campaigns. But
what rights and what is being redistributed from whom to whom?
so, yes, so one form of redistribution addresses the question of caste, which is to entrench what a form of affirmative action that in India is known as reservations. So, which implies
Is
that
this what do they call it? Backward?
yes, so backward classes, scheduled castes. There are two major categories. So there are the scheduled castes, which are the former untouchables, or what are
Dalits?
colloquially called in India Dalits, and that is a constitutional list. So there is a schedule to the constitution which lists them out, and periodically, of course, I think changes are made to it. And then there is another category which was intended to be an administrative category called the other backward classes, and routinely social groups are added to them as well. So currently, what both groups enjoy reservations in school admissions, in government jobs, and so on and so forth. There have been two. The Congress Party is now, one of their manifesto promises is to hold a caste census, which is something that hasn't happened in India, to really kind of enumerate what proportion of the population is in what caste or in what social group, and
To
then to
what end?
so we've had until now a 50% cap on reservations. So what the Congress Party is promising is a breach of that 50% cap and an increase in the number of quotas, or in the amount of seats that are, whether they're jobs, whether they're in the bureaucracy, whether they're in schools and universities, is a breach in that quota, and to have a far larger category of or number of seats or positions going into the reserved category.
And the ruling party, the BJP, this distinguishes the two, because the BJP isn't promising that. That's a Congress party promise.
So that is very much a Congress Party promise. The other Congress Party promise, and it's less of a promise in the manifesto and more something that they like to speak about, is also a question of concentration of wealth. So the Congress is insisting that they will do a financial survey to determine who holds the country's wealth, and to have greater mechanisms for its redistribution. Because one of the things that has happened in India, especially post-COVID, is that inequality has been increasing at a pretty rapid pace. And some would argue that that's okay, because, well, as long as even those at the bottom of the pyramid benefit by X, it's all right if those at the top of the pyramid benefit by 100X. And Modi himself has had quite a lot of success with certain forms of welfarism, which is the provision of cooking gas, the building of toilets, piped water, and so on and so forth. But what the Congress is promising, and it's not quite clear what exactly it's promising, but it seems to be something bigger than whether that would translate into increased taxes, whether that would translate into increased provision of rural employment guarantee programs. I mean, one of the things they have said they would give is guaranteed employment for 1 year to college graduates, with and guaranteed internships and things like that.
Okay, so handing out sort of plum positions, potentially raising taxes, redistributing it. What's the BJP offering now? I mean, you said it's a referendum. Are they offering more of the same?
They're essentially more of the same, and that is reflected in there's definitely certain pretty big things which have been achieved in Modi's tenure. I mean, the economy is growing at a pretty rapid clip, even though, yes, large-scale unemployment remains a big problem. These welfare measures, including free food, grain, and stuff, have really helped people at the bottom of the pyramid, even though one could say that inequality has been rising at a fast pace. And one of the things that Modi, of course, has done, is widely seen to have done, is improve India's standing in the world. And
Mm.
so, things like India now becoming the fifth largest economy in the world, and so on and so forth, do very much play into the idea that things are good.
And you know, I've heard that, but you know, all politics are local. Kitchen table issues typically prevail. Is anyone talking about jobs? As I understand it, just the sheer number of jobs have remained fairly stagnant in the last decade. Correct me if I'm wrong, but
Oh, you're
just
right.
employment and job
Yeah.
creation. Who's
You're,
talking about that? Because that would solve a lot of the problem. We can redistribute over here. We can, you know, fiddle with who gets what position over there. Is anyone talking about not just growing the economy, but growing employment?
Uh, yes and no. So Modi did create a Ministry of Skill Development, and so on and so forth. But the problem of jobs isn't just a problem of jobs. It's actually the effect of several different factors. The first being that India never really got off the ground in terms of large-scale manufacturing. So it's something that they didn't do. And that is part of the one piece of the puzzle. The
And
second
to
piece of
combat that, is that part of the reason why the infrastructure is going gangbusters? Are they trying
yeah,
to
yeah.
cultivate that? When you talk
So
or read the
they are,
financial
yeah, yeah. I
the
mean, they
financial
are. There's
pages here and elsewhere, you'll talk to large businesses and they say, look, we would love to friend shore, as they say, to
mm,
India, except how do we get things from A to B? It's very messy.
yeah. So there is tremendous investment in infrastructure. There is a lot of planning for, in a sense, to improve logistics. There's also a lot of subsidies, what they call production-linked incentives, which are being paid into certain sectors, particularly certain types of advanced manufacturing, mobile phones being one of them, advanced chips being one of
Mhm.
them. So you've had certain companies like Apple, like Foxconn,
Mhm.
like Samsung come in quite a big way, and that is a pretty big success story. But the problem is, as I said, was the lack of large-scale manufacturing, because these are, again, while these aren't going to generate mass employment.
Mhm.
Uh, the second is the lack of skill, which goes back to India's problem of education, in that you're not really producing a particularly skilled population. So even if you want to do many things, you actually have an overabundance of unskilled labor and a pretty
Yeah.
big shortage of skilled labor, especially in sectors where you would need them, engineers. There
Yeah,
are
and
all
to a
sorts.
degree, you have a brain drain also. I mean, the kids I saw at IIT where I taught, you ask them
Yeah,
what they want to do. The answer is
and
either go into the bureaucracy or move
yeah,
to America and work for
yeah.
Google or something like it.
Or Google or Microsoft. If you go to
Mhm.
somewhere like Seattle, you will notice. I mean, I went to Microsoft's campus in Seattle, and I discovered that something like 40 to 50% of Microsoft's workforce in Redmond, uh, I think it's in Redmond, is are Indian passport holders. So you have brain drain, you have lack of skill, you have, in a sense, a kind of overproduction of semi-skilled labor, which doesn't want to go into unskilled jobs, but isn't fit enough to go into professions which do demand a great degree of skill.
Mhm.
So there are surveys which will point out that something like 70% of India's engineers are considered unemployable, or learning
Mhm.
outcomes are poor, in that you will have someone studying in grade 10 who can't really do fourth grade mathematics.
Yeah.
So there are multiple problems, not just and then there are, of course, other outcomes, which is, lack of nutrition, which leads to the fact that something like one third of India's children are stunted, and so on and so forth.
Mm.
So
So
there are
and
multiple
who's
problems that
what
it's
are
an
what are the different parties' takes on nutrition? On do they differ in any way? I mean, this you point out a
I
substantial
think
problem.
I mean, it is a huge problem,
I
and
mean, we did
that
see
is
the
also a
attempted
problem.
agricultural reforms, which didn't work out.
Which didn't work out, which there were huge protests against. And that's also, you know, a and a good example of how organized civil society, there is still space for organized civil society action, even though the government demonized them, saying, they're separatists, they're terrorists, they're so on and so forth. It was a very successful, from the point of view of a protest movement, it was very successful. It got a government with a full majority to roll back a series of laws which they had put a lot of political capital on the line to bring. So aside from that, there is the question of nutrition, of skilling, etc. And I don't think it really, I don't think any party is really talking about it. The Congress Party did have the Right to Food Act and so on and so forth when the last time they were in power, which does address some points, but I don't think anyone really has a plan to address these questions in their totality.
Okay. So the distinctions here are the Congress Party promises redistribution of a variety of things.
Yeah.
And the BJP, Modi's party, says, hey, we're rising in the world. Take pride in yourself. Everyone's moving up at least a little bit financially. And we are bringing people out of poverty. We're building, and people in the West don't quite understand this, but toilets and
giving you piped water.
Natural gas, and as opposed to wood or dung and inhaling all of that, which takes a decade or two off the lives of principally women.
Yeah.
And you talk about toilets, and toilets, of course, are important, but also that can reduce rape and assault. So you're talking about if you don't have great nutrition, maybe you're stunted, at least what you're eating and drinking is clean. It's not fantastic, but that's better. So that's what Modi's party offers.
Yeah.
When are these results due? And what significance do you see in those results?
So the results are due on the 4th, but I just want to say one quick thing about what the two parties are offering. So even though this might be what they're offering on the economic question, there are several other factors at play, which are issues of culture, issues of religion, issues of caste, which also determine voter behavior. So one of the things that happened in Modi's second term was the building of the Ram temple at Ayodhya, which was a huge issue and had an issue that had dominated Indian politics in the late 80s and early 90s.
Yeah, just briefly, part of the huge issue was it was built on the ground where a mosque stood that was destroyed many decades ago. I don't remember the
in
year.
1992, 22 years
92. Ago. And this temple is enormous. It was opened, even though it's not completed, it was opened in around the time of a local election or local elections, perhaps. And
it was opened earlier this year, just a few months ago. And the idea, of course, is that is the culmination of a kind of Hindu nationalist dream that has been around for 50 years. There is Modi's withdrawal of the special status of Kashmir, so the ending of Article 370, which gave Kashmir a slightly different constitutional status to every other Indian province, which has also been a Hindu nationalist demand going back 75, 80 odd years. So
and in the Western media, I can tell you the revocation of that special status is viewed, or at least is written up as, the Hindu nationalist boot of Modi put on the neck of the Muslims, that it is not so much a celebration of what is the majority religion as it is a sign of oppression of the minority religion. I mean, that is what you read right and left.
Yeah, I mean, there's no denying that many Muslims see it as such, and that many Hindus see it as such as well. So much of the triumphalist rhetoric that you saw in India in light of that revocation was the idea that we're going to go and buy land in Kashmir. We're going to go and sit up in the mountains and enjoy the lakes, etc. So there was a lot of triumphalist rhetoric which framed it in exactly those terms. So
And that
I'm not
rhetoric came from where? The BJP itself?
definitely from sections of the BJP,
Okay.
not from Modi and not from the top leadership, but definitely from certain
And
sections.
top leadership
Uh,
framed it how? Just we built
top
this temple,
leadership
isn't it
friend,
great?
yes, as a kind of celebration of India's cultural heritage and civilizational heritage,
Okay.
because
Okay.
obviously Ram was considered revered by many millions, and many millions do believe that the mosque stood in place of a temple that had been demolished in the 16th
Uh,
century.
I failed to point that out. Yes.
So, and many saw it as a kind of righting of a historical wrong, and so there were a wide set of beliefs that went into it on both sides.
Mhm.
But so there's no denying that many Muslims saw it in the terms that you mentioned, and that many Hindus also saw it in the terms that you mentioned. So I'm not surprised that that view it comes out in the media, but there is a
It's
lot,
the dominant
yeah.
narrative in what
But
I've read
there's a
in
lot more
America.
going on than that, and so those have been two long pending Hindu nationalist demands, or in a sense, two long pending points in their manifestos, which they've been giving out for the last 80 years. And one of the things that issues that Modi is really running on is are those two are planks, as saying, look at what I have delivered. I've delivered what we failed to do for the last 80 years. And for those who've been voting for the BJP or its forerunner BJS for so long, this has been two of their very core promises. This is what we're going to do when we have power. And it's something that they've done when they had power. So there is a certain element of the fact of saying we should be allowed another election victory, or we should be given another election
Yeah,
victory
promises kept,
on the
right?
fact that we've
We followed
kept these
through.
promises, which you've been waiting for 80 years for.
Yeah. So to get back, when are the results? When will we find out
So
the
we will
results of the
know
election?
on the 4th of June,
4th of
which is
June.
counting day. And I think the results are tremendously significant because first, they will put, if should Modi win, he will go into the pantheon of greats, because hardly anyone apart from Nehru has won 3 elections on a trot. Yeah, well, no one apart from Nehru has won 3 elections on literally on the trot. He will have really cemented his own power. So as I said, India's structure anyway concentrates power in certain spots, and that concentration will be made even more acute and, in a sense, even more legitimate should he win with the kind of numbers that many expect him to win.
If he wins
Um,
in a trot, do you think he would go for another term? Um, sort of.
yeah, why not? I mean, if he,
Yeah.
but I do think things change in politics really fast. And there is constant both chatter and opinion that things are not going as well as the BJP had hoped.
Yeah.
We'll have to wait till June 4th to find out. But even if it wins, I don't believe in the kind of doom and gloom to say that there will never be elections again. He will change the constitution. India will,
Okay.
end its status as a democracy and go into unbridled autocracy mode. I do think part and parcel of Modi's image itself is the democratic legitimacy it enjoys. He would not be who he is if he had not won with the humongous mandates that he has.
So you're
Um,
saying, contrary to some reporting,
mhm.
that Modi is an autocrat, almost delights in it, if you read some of these pieces. You're
I mean,
saying,
I'm sure he does. So I'm not denying that he may not have an autocratic personality, or he may not have autocratic tendencies, but he's neither unique in having those tendencies, uh, and nor is he able to nor is he having to overturn some sort of constitutional settlement to give rein to those tendencies. So,
But at the very least, he has to maintain the appearance of democratic legitimacy, and that's really kind of unfair. The appearance. I mean, people are voting, right?
yeah,
I mean, no
people
one's
are
claiming the
voting.
election
Yeah.
is rigged. As much of the press I read doesn't like Modi, one thing they tend not to say is that it's somehow rigged or everybody's in the tank on this. They can write it up different ways. One of the piece I wrote was that women just do what their husbands tell them to do, which I find to be sort of nonsense because of the reasons we've outlined. I mean, women do the cooking. Women want toilets. Women don't want to have to go to the village well to get water. They'd rather turn on a tap, and they'd
No, and
also
if
rather
polling
know
and
that
if
the water's
and if
clean.
polling data is to be believed, then women also vote in greater numbers for Modi than men do.
Yeah. Now, if the Congress Party wins, that would be a sea change. I mean, that would be seen
Yeah.
as a rebuff of
Yeah.
much of Modi's efforts and maybe even a part of his legacy. So there's quite a bit on the line here. Well, I don't want to
There is
take
quite a bit
any.
of line, and there's quite a bit, on the line for Modi, but there's quite a bit on the line for the BJP itself, because again, as I mentioned, in this kind of authoritarian by design argument, Indian parties don't function the way parties function in the West. They are highly centralized. Legislators once elected are subjected to the party whip. And besides, nobody wants to be disqualified and have to fight an election and spend another $1 million again. And so it really allows the party boss to cement his grip on the parties. So while Modi is popular and has sitting on the chair of executive power, all is well and good. But should he get off that, or should he be unseated from there, I'm pretty certain that what would happen is that it would allow his rivals and his challengers in the BJP the room to maneuver within the party.
Yeah.
So there's actually a lot at stake for the BJP itself.
Well, Tripa Daman, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. Noted historian. Thank you. And thank you all for listening to FO Talks. Please join us again. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.